Good morning. Thank you very much to all participants connected on this training session, and thank you to our host institution, CITO, the Central Information and Technology Office of Belize. Welcome to this sixth and final dedicated introductory training in open data of the project Promoting an Open Government Ecosystem in Belize, implemented by the Trust for the Americas and the Department for Effective Public Management of the OAS, with the support of the Embassy of the United States of America in Belize. Today's session is the last one of the program that we started 3 weeks ago with all of you. For this session, we have a renowned expert talking to us about different aspects, different technical aspects to use open data. After today's session, participants will have acquired basic and advanced knowledge needed to take on your own open data initiatives. We're happy here at the Department for Effective Public Management for that. Again, my name is Mike Mora, and I'm with the Department for Effective Public Management of the OAS. Our goal with these sessions is to embrace, specialize, and develop skills in a dedicated group of officers to innovate, transcend, and improve in public service delivery through open government. I want to thank you all for your attendance and commitment today and during the last weeks. Please let our project coordinator know, Mr. Henry Waite, about your ideas to continue engaging with this project in Belize. Bear in mind that the project is not just these training sessions. We are walking a path to build and strengthen the open government ecosystem in Belize. Also with concrete actions and seek funding for projects to undertake open data and open government initiatives. So stay in contact with our local coordinator will be my best advice with this last session. We will hear from Mr. Waite at the end during the Q&A session after the presentation is done. For the Q&A session, please prepare your questions and share them throughout the presentation using the chat tool for this platform. You'll see it on the bottom right of your screen. We will collect the questions and have them ready for the speaker once his presentation is over. So thank you. Just keep that in mind. We want to have a fluid Q&A session. And without further ado, I would like to present the speaker of the day, Mr. Juan Manuel Casanueva from Mexico. Connecting from Mexico, Juan Manuel is the Executive Director of SocialTIC and leads the School of Data in its Spanish version. He has 15 years of experience in the civil society sector in Mexico, participated in development, education, environmental, and the ICT4D projects. Also in the private sector, where he served as a consultant for corporate strategy, operations, and business intelligence in the company Accenture. Juan Manuel has a master's degree in management and implementation of development projects from the University of Manchester and a bachelor's degree in industrial and systems engineering from Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey campus in Mexico. I know well Juan Manuel for many years now. We see each other very often, besides to see each other in these web sessions, and so it's a pleasure to have him here. He is definitely a champion of open data in the region, and as I said, well known, and it is a leader, a true leader of open data, working with civil society, not only in Mexico but throughout the region. He could tell us more about it in his presentation. So with that introduction, I will let you take on from now, Juan Manuel. I'm gonna just load your presentation, and you can start from there. I'm gonna turn my camera off as well, so you can continue. Thank you very much, Juan Manuel. Just open your mic, and it's all yours.
Thank you so much. Let me know if you can hear me well. Thanks, Mike, for the introduction. Thank you all for joining this webinar, this last webinar. As the presentation just loads in the platform, I'd like to share a couple of thoughts before just diving in the topics we're going to talk about today. The first thing I'd like to share with you guys is that we've been working on opening data from a practical side with basically two approaches. First of all, to understand what data should be open that is relevant for governments, but also for citizens. And the second one is the goal of like all this the open data um, efforts, which is why should we open data and what is the data for. So most of my reflections today will be based on practice. You have a lot of resources. You can actually revise many of the international theory that is online. But I like to share many of the things we've actually seen and learned, and from like practical examples, working not only with the Mexican government, but Mexican civil society, but also other Latin American allies, both in the public or in the civil society sector, regarding opening and using data. The key thing regarding using data here would be not only the technical aspects, which I'll be pointing out, but how does people actually end up consuming and using data, and eventually, as following a government perspective, how would you consider defining a project that has to do with the use of data and eventually having the feedback to identify the priorities that you should follow as government in order to put all the efforts in opening data. So I don't know if we have the presentation online. I don't see it per se.
You have it there on your screen on the left side.
On the
You're not
left
seeing it right
side. I cannot see it. Let me see.
Are you using a laptop computer or?
Let me see. Well, I can't see the presentation, but if everybody can see it, I mean that's wonderful. Maybe we can go step by step on this.
Juan Manuel, are you? Um, do you see your camera right now? Your video?
Yes, I see my video, and that's and I hear you well.
In the chat, are you seeing it too?
I see the chat. I do not see. I see just a blank gray, like a gray space block instead of the presentation, even though it says.
The rest of the participants looking at the presentation right now. Can you just confirm through the chat, please? Anyone can tell us if you're seeing it. Okay.
Apparently,
all right.
everybody can see it besides me. So what I can do is I have my presentation also in the computer, so we can start with the agenda. In the agenda, basically the topics we're going to be covering today have to do with first of all, identify how data is basically consumed, usually when we're talking about like open data projects. And then we're going to start off talking about how to build like data-driven solutions, projects, or products. And we will eventually end up looking at different types of uses of the data and what that has implied. So if we can go to slide number 3, I'm gonna start talking about like how data is consumed by different kinds of people. And the next slide shows a very characteristic slide and image that is part of the core of the open data community, and also the core of people that like cakes. And sorry for my bad jokes, but usually the analogy here with this image is that sometimes the raw data, the tables, the JSONs, all the formats you already seen and talked about in previous sessions. And I remember Fabricio mentioned a bit about formats, and also Camila talked about formats. It's basically the ingredients that, in an analogy, would be basically the ingredients for any kind of dish. And if those ingredients are put together, sometimes, and the analogy would be analysis, you can actually end up building the part of something that can eventually be eaten. But if it's not decorated or looks tasty enough at the end, and that's the process of presentation, um, that will not be attractive enough or tasty enough for people to actually consume that dish, or in this case, the product that is based on data. And once the product is consumed um, by the end user, it is actually finished, and that eventually is when people understand what the data was about, arrive to the conclusions of basically the analysis before the data, and addresses the knowledge that was behind most of that data that had to do with that. So, I mean, this analogy is quite interesting and enlightening because it focuses us on basically two figures. We're talking about like two roles are key for consuming and building products based on data. One has to do with the end user, and we'll talk about end users later, just hold on a bit. And the other has to do with the intermediary, which is in the data community called the infomediary. And we have a little nice cartoon that's in slide number five, continuing with the notion of the chef and the data challenges. The intermediary is that person. It could be a team, could be a person that actually transforms raw data into compelling, relevant, and knowledge-driven products. And usually this intermediary, and I stress that could be a team, or could be even sometimes individuals, are the ones who have to deal with everything and all the challenges and all the capacities that are inherent of managing data. Everything that you had Camila talk about in terms of all the abilities you need to reach and to build in terms of using data, for example, gathering data, generating data, identifying data sources, or even the other management of the data that is necessary for instance, scraping or cleaning, and furthermore, analyzing and putting it together so it can be presented in an appealing way through graphic design, through sometimes coding in terms of like what the product is going to be, and eventually storytelling. So the key lesson here is that sometimes in government we have to identify where are we. Are we basically the ones that are just putting out the raw data? And if that is the case, we should know what the scope of that activity is. If we're playing in a role of intermediaries, we should have a clear notion of what those data-driven projects are going to be, and their scope and what they want to achieve with end users, or if we're basically end users and we're consuming the data. So I'm just gonna have an example just to clarify the notion of what the intermediary does, and to take away the images of a very tasty cake and put it on digital terms. If we go to slide number 6, I'll let you know a very raw version about what ingredients, not in the kitchen, but yes, in the digital world, can look like. This is an open format, which is JSON. You saw it with Camila's session a week ago. That is basically the raw data. You identify the different variables that have to do, in this case, with legislative information. In this case, you have like a print screen of the publications of bills from the Mexican Chamber of Deputies, from the Congress. And you can totally see that is basically, that is an open format so that it can be machine readable. So we're talking about core basic open data in this slide that can tell a machine, not a human, what are the different variables regarding a bill that is being debated and in the Mexican, in this case, the Mexican Congress. But if we go to the next slide, which is slide number 7, we have an interface which is made for humans, which is basically a digital interface. In this case, it's a website, could be also a mobile app, which calls all those variables through an API, the database, so it can call the different variables so it can be shown in the screen. So basically, we're here seeing the two things, no? The ingredients and the ending presentation of what an app or a website on information on legislative bills and people looks like. And if you identify the variables in something that goes back to data architecture, for instance, the name of a congressperson, for instance, we can see the photo and the name of Martina Santillan, which was a congresswoman from the state of Michoacán. All those different variables are the ones that are separated by commas in the JSON file we saw before. The interesting thing here is that an intermediary, in this case, is the one that actually understands how to organize, structure the data, to clean it, and to make it have sense so that, in this case, a machine, a website, can actually use the API to contact the database to call in the different variables or information from that base, so anybody, the end user, can see it, in this case, in a website on a mobile app. I don't know if everything is okay there, and you've stopped thinking about cakes and gone back to data architecture and identified the role of the intermediary. The next thing is key in terms of identifying what is needed to identify the use of data, which is what users want. And in slide number 8, we have a very simple graph that identifies what is valuable for different kinds of users. And to make it very simple, we usually identify two kinds of users: end users, the ones that consume the database or driven product. And these two categories are basically non-specialized users or very specialized users. Usually a non-specialized user is somebody that sometimes doesn't know that much about the topic, and sometimes it's the one that doesn't have the technical skills to go about and analyze and manage the data. Specialized users are the ones that do have the data management capacities, but also know what the data is about. For instance, academics, sometimes investigative journalists, or different specialists on different topics are the ones that need and that have the most value out of raw data, those tables. Sometimes if they have like pivot tables or some kinds of some products that have to do with filtering or other kinds of formats like that can be used to do certain analysis, are very valuable for those kinds of users because they know the data, they know how to manage and use it and do the analysis, and they have enough thematic context on those data to arrive to conclusions. But we have to understand that non-specialized users, like for example, if you're talking about environment, I would be a non-specialized user, so I don't know anything about biology, ecology, or anything that have to do with climate change. I know about technology. I need an intermediary to take me by the hand, sometimes through visualizations, infographics, in other kinds of formats, so I can understand what the data is saying. So previously, the intermediary basically had the challenge to not only understand the data herself, but also do an interface through graphic design, visualization, graphs, so that the non-specialized user can understand that. And the less a person knows about the topic and has the capacities to manage data is when there is more need for intermediaries to tell the stories about, slowly, step by step, mostly from general aspects to particular aspects, on how what the data is saying through storytelling. For instance, the next slide, which is the slide number 9, has a very concrete division of different kinds of formats and what they are using those formats for. And I really like this chart because, first of all, I mean, it is not focused on government, it's focused more on advocacy, but it's very vivid. And it's based on what objectives you want to achieve in order to bring the data out towards the end users. And the first thing we see at the top level is if you want the users just to get the idea of something, for example, and the result of an analysis or a proportion or a comparison between two variables, for example, sometimes you need to use a combination between simple graphics but also lots of visual images. And we're going to have some examples about this really quickly. And the key thing here is that you cannot make the end user eat all the cake. Yeah, they have to understand particular elements, basic context, to get the idea of what you're actually talking about, or which is what the data is about. In basic storytelling, end users would have to understand what we're talking about, the topic, for instance, problematics, very clearly, in order to just slowly can deep dive and to understand broader, challenging objectives. For instance, to understand a context or a pattern. And then we go to the next section, which is get the picture. How can you understand what is going on? And you can imagine a pattern, think about climate change, think about traffic, think about like how different economic variables have changed throughout the years, depending on economic policies, etc. And you need to explain sometimes that data that has to do, for example, about variances over time. And you need to tell the stories, and there it is common to use formats such as animations, maps, or infographics that try to take the end user by the hand and just make them understand different sequences, parts, or reflections upon the data that is basically being used. And the third part of this chart is specifically targeting specialized users. Only the specialized users are the ones that have the capacity, the interest, and the thematic knowledge to understand the detail. Yes, and I will stress that a lot because it is a very common mistake. We've seen it throughout the years in different countries, so that we expect end users, basic users, to get into the details of things and topics that they don't understand. Sometimes you will see simulation, very complex graphics, sometimes even the raw tables, and that is very hard for them. Yeah, formats such as dynamic databases, complex visualizations, interactives are usually targeting specialized users. They can actually arrive into knowledge and to conclusions based on the data, what those products does, but most importantly on their knowledge and their own questions that challenge them to arrive to conclusions and knowledge on the data. I'll give you 3 examples regarding, first of all, getting the idea, then the picture, and then the detail. One basic infographic that is quite famous in the storytelling world has to do with coffee. No, if you haven't had your coffee yet, this is the chance. But basically, this is getting the idea, and we're talking about proportions. If you convert these little coffee cups, they have different proportions of coffee, water, foam, cream, milk, into pie charts. It's basically the same thing. But using images, in this case, just proves the point. It is not statistically or technically exact because you have basically a coffee cup with a proportion and you don't have percentages or data. But at the end, what you need the users is to get the idea and to be able to understand what a double espresso is in comparison to an Americano, in comparison to macchiato. Basically, that is the goal of these infographics. If we go to the next one, slide 11, we have another infographic that brings upon a greater challenge, which is to get a picture and to explain something. And there you have different variables that aim to take the end user by the hand so they can understand and compare, for instance, throughout time, and you have a y-axis on your left part of the infographic that identifies not only the passage of time, how many years have passed, and how much the sea level has risen in different contexts of the world, specifically very well-known cities. So you can see that in 100 years, the sea will rise 1 meter, and cities like Venice, which are basically on the verge of the sea, or sometimes even deeper, will start going underwater. After up to 100 years and up to 200 years, other cities like Los Angeles, Amsterdam will go underwater, and so forth. So at the end, we're explaining the consequences of sea rising due to climate change. And if you could actually understand the data in detail, many of us that are very interested in these kinds of topics would rather have the data or a very complex simulator and identify the different details of not only the timing but also the different parts of the world that the sea will rise more than others. But to get the picture, this is enough and does perfectly the job. And for instance, we'll go for the last example, which is a journalistic piece that has been done in very different contexts. I don't know if Belize has had one of these, but this is the Costa Rican version of an analysis that has been done by a lot of journalists, which tries to understand, to make people understand, okay, what is the status between the different types of jobs and the salaries that you could actually be earning if you study such university career. So in this case, we're talking about like a digital simulator that identifies different variables, and here it is the user that actually explores by identifying the type of career, and explores and compares, which involves the end users to make that kind of exercise, which careers are actually earning more than others. And not only which careers are earning more than others, and you see that on the horizontal axis of each of those graphics, but also what is the rate of unemployment of such careers. So here, for instance, I've already just put on the slide 3 types of different university careers. For instance, you'll see on your left side the arts. You'll see in the middle engineering. In the middle you'll see social sciences, and on the right you'll see engineering. And once you play around with the data, you arrive to the conclusion, if you understand the 2 axes and the complex and the different variables, that, for example, engineering careers are better paid and have less unemployment rates than the other 2. Nonetheless, you'll see that also with lower unemployment rates are the arts and humanities careers, but they are reaching less better paid salaries than the engineers. All right. So basically, we have the user there playing around and looking at the values so that it can arrive to basic, in this case, basic conclusions. But you can imagine that these kinds of, like, for instance, simulators can go into very much more complex topics. For instance, budgeting. I'll show you guys some examples later about like budgeting and other kinds of aspects. So I'd like to stop here really quickly and go and answer one key questions. Once we identify that we have to bring a solution based on data, what has to be taken into account in order to bring a very well solution, or to put it in cake terms, what do we need to consider in order to have an amazing cake that actually the people who want it to consume would not only buy it but eat it all and enjoy it. And we'll go to the slide number 14, which is the key elements that we've identified based on practice mostly, on what do we need to consider to identify the right product or the right output based on data. First of all, and this is key, I'm not going to go dive into that, but it's basically to understand what the user really needs. Sometimes we have seen a common mistake, which is basically getting people that already have the data just to bring out whatever they can think of based on the data, and assume that people will actually consume those products. So we are being usually flooded by infographics, by simulators, by dynamic infographics, in lots of different charts and graphs in different formats. And basically, sometimes people don't want to know about that, or don't want to arrive to those conclusions. Yes. So the first key is to understand what the users really need. And then I'll have some examples later on projects that have actually nailed and been very successful based on identifying user needs. The second thing has to do with the data required to fulfill that need. Sometimes we've seen there are very ambitious projects, but sometimes the relevant data is not either open or is not used in those projects. So here the key thing is what data do you need to assess those requirements from the end users. And I'll take a break here and do a reflection that is going to be quite relevant at the end of the presentation. Sometimes when you're in government, your role is basically to just open the data, to make the data public, and sometimes you don't even have the mandate or sometimes the time to ask the potential data users what do they need. All right. Slowly, as open government and open data policies start increasing and become much more relevant with people's needs, those questions are important. One of the things we've done with, for instance, part of the Mexican government is to identify exactly what data is more relevant than others, so that the open processes of data within the government can actually mean something much more for the users, and not only just have the teams within government opening all the data they have just because it's a mandate to open data. The data should be addressing people's needs, not only in terms of products, but in terms of like what is relevant and what do they want to know. The third thing that it's key to identify what type of output is could be drawn based on data is basically how the data should be transformed in order that it could be consumed. Here is where you identify what format is the best for the user to actually understand and consume that data. Is it going to be an infographic? Is it going to be a simulator? Is it going to be a website that has some dynamic functionalities? Is it going to be just a graph? All right. There, not only do you need what you're going to actually show or present or teach or reveal, but also understand where is the user and what's the format that's much more useful for the user. And I have some examples a bit later. And the other thing, and I'll go to slide number 15, to reach that last point is other variables are key for data-driven projects. And I'll mention basically 5 of them, and I'll stop on each one of them. For instance, whenever you're opening data within your institutions, sometimes you will have a great will to do it, but sometimes you have to deal with local, internal, institutional policies and normativity. It is very important to understand, or sometimes even to change, if you have the mandate to do it, to change normativity so that open data can be not only produced but be relevant as a mandate of your government area or project. And sometimes we've seen some resistance between not only within government but also other parts of government, because they address like policies that did not consider open data in previous years or previous mandates. And sometimes it's important to talk about like, okay, how should we address local normativity policies, for instance, personal data, for instance, transparency, for instance, to proactively use the data so that it could actually bring a value not only for citizens but also for government. The second thing has to do with adequate technology infrastructure and platforms. We know that there's usually restrictions between the different areas within government on what technology should be used and what platforms can be used. All right. Sometimes it's very hard to be at a fast pace that the private sector usually is using, because the complexities of the public sector are larger, and the challenges and responsibilities within sometimes government data is also very strict and also very large. One of the things here that we need to consider whenever we're talking about like building and bringing data to the public is actually what constraints do you have. If you have constraints regarding security, if you have constraints regarding different kinds of technology platforms, coding, and different kinds of plugins, it is very important just to put them on the table and see what is the best output based on the restrictions that an institution can have. Two big debates are usually common whenever you address open data within the public sector. First of all is, should you have the data gathered and in databases within the public sector, or can you actually put it in private third-party databases or services? For instance, all those cloud-based services like Amazon or others, in which you can actually have the data there, but it's not hosted and it does not live within the public sector, even though it's managed by the government itself. That is one key debate that usually appears whenever you're talking about like adequate technology. And the other has to do with relevant technology. Sometimes public institutions have use technology that is a bit outdated, and sometimes the requirements of the end users, and we go back to one of the requirements beforehand I just talked about, is basically on much more agile or sometimes interactive platforms. So there is usually that kind of debate that should be addressed within not only the data teams but also the technology and the infrastructure teams and also the social communication teams. The third thing that we have to consider all the time whenever you're talking about like how the data should be addressed and used is, do you have the data? Do you have the data available, and if it's in formats that you can actually interoperate with? For instance, two common mistakes that we see in projects is that once the project, think about that as a website or an app, mobile app, or even a simulator, sometimes they get out of date really fast because the data did not get updated. They just uploaded within the solution the data of a certain period of time, and as time passes, nobody else updated that data. And sometimes even when you have a technological connection through an API, for instance, to a database, sometimes things change with the database or the API, and you get some bugs, or you lose the link between the end user's point of contact, which is your product, and the database that is showing there. So that's something that is very, very important there. And the second thing is that sometimes some data will stop being available or will stop being comparable. We're going back to data formats and documentation. No, for instance, I will show to you some projects that have to do with the education quality assessments in Mexico that started off as an amazing platform so that families can understand the quality of education in different schools. But as the types of assessments on quality of education change, they were not comparable after certain years. So there, the availability of comparable data is key to understand and to take into account when you're building solutions based on data. And the two last things have to do with user and end user involvement. The main purpose of open data in an open government context is that people can actually understand what the government is doing and actually do things, whatever, produce knowledge, bring services, arrive into conclusions and analysis based on that data. And at the end, it's basically citizen participation. Opening data is not enough. Having a data portal sometimes is not enough. You have to engage with users. And you, as we mentioned before, you have sometimes two kinds of users. The top-end specialized users, they have particular technological and thematic data requirements and needs, but also you have the non-specialized everyday end users that basically consume that data that has been transformed by the intermediaries. And there, the relationship between institutions and users is very important, because the users at the end need to understand and sometimes even identify that certain data is being opened and communicated by the government. Because, I mean, if you, from your government area, just publish a new report or new data, or you want the people to get engaged, and automatically, by magic, they will not either identify that that is being done, and you need an involvement or social communication strategy so that people actually understand, oh, there is a data, government data, I can use it, or there are some solutions that I can actually use. So we've seen so many projects, not only from government, but also from civil society, just be forgotten because there was not an adequate strategy and action to make those data public. And sometimes you do need to answer to those questions and the requirements and the needs of the users, and in this case are also the citizens. So I'm going to stop here to see if you have any questions for now, before we can just go into different kinds and types of projects, so we can see in practice what has been done with open data, and both on the government side, but also on the journalism and civil society side. So, does anybody have a question so far?
Thank you, Juan Manuel. Let's see if nobody has posted anything on in the chat. Henry just a few minutes ago reminded us to send the questions there. We'll see. Let's give it a few seconds. If no one shows up, then we probably can continue and leave it for the end.
If nobody shows up, I think I'm being very clear or extremely unclear.
No, I think very clear, and it's building on the, as you mentioned, on the different sessions that we had. So I think it's great the way it's landing on this.
Thanks, Pablo. All right. Well, let me continue then. I'm going to be showing several projects that we've been in touch with directly or indirectly. Most of them are in Spanish because of our area of work. But I'd like to share some of the behind the scenes we know about those projects. No, one of the things that sometimes we're quite skeptical about showcasing English speaking projects is that they usually come from the UK or the US, in which they, because of their data infrastructure, technology infrastructure, and open data in government um, um, context, don't have the complexities that at least we've seen in Latin America. So I hope you guys are probably in the middle, but you can find lots of inspirational projects based on data in English. But the behind the scenes usually we have more in common with Latin America than with the Americans and the British sometimes. So I'm going to start, and I'll start dividing the projects on like the nature of their data, based on how they want the data to support the needs of the users. And I'll start with something we call data as a platform. If open government identifies government as a platform for citizens and citizen solutions, sometimes we'll see projects that see data as a platform for specialized users to build on top, to use that the data and reach different conclusions based on that data. No, and the first one is something that has been being built at least for the Mexican government, but I know many other Latin American governments for a while now, which is basically a fiscal transparency portal. And the fiscal transparency portal usually has the detailed data of budgets, national budgets. You'll see in many cases as the open government and open data agenda increases, it becomes more relevant. Also, similar portals at a state or provincial or sometimes even municipal level, in which it's very clear not only in their open data buttons or sections that you can download the files where you see program by program, entity by entity, and the types of expense by expense, all the different details, not only of a budget, but also of the actually expenditures that the government at different levels has. The interesting part, and I'd like to share about this project, is that at least the Mexican recent team that is involved in fiscal transparency has tried to join the links and is very conscious that sites like these are very complex for common day citizens. And they understand that, yes, the data will be downloaded by specialists on fiscal transparency and also sometimes investigative journalists or researchers, and they are the ones going to be all doing all the analysis based on that data. And they've tried to do different interfaces so that people with less skills, both thematically and data skills, can actually reach out and understand the data. And Slide Editing is basically it's an example of one of those efforts. This is something we have been working with them in the past now 3 years, which is basically a rally that is done once a year, in which we put some incentives, usually some prizes, computers, money, that kind of stuff, and we have like an open call for citizens to analyze and to go and verify the data of the public construction information. So what happens at once a year is that different teams of regular citizens, you might have some citizens that are students. We've seen a lot of students that are studying economy or social sciences, and they are they are incentivized to go to the portal, understand much better the portal, and dive in to the information, both the raw data but also the interfaces like the map you're seeing here, that has to do with public construction and contracting. And the rally consists of them identifying and verifying that that information is correct and bringing about little kind of like stories about them. You know, so that has brought in the 3 years basically three interesting results. The first one is that you have citizens sometimes validating when the information is not adequate or right. For instance, one of the big challenges the fiscal transparency area has had with public procurement and expenses is that the data regarding the progress of the constructions, for instance, is updated by the responsibles, the government responsibles of that construction. Some another data specifics that sometimes have been caught by citizens and then updated and changed by government, it is that they are adequately geolocated. So you can actually use and see exactly in the map, and that it is actually where that construction or that project is being built. So that's been one big lesson about like how to involve citizens to bring accountability and just get to know better the data. The second thing has been so that some groups, and I'm talking about like college students to like specialized NGOs, have done like specific analysis on why are certain projects that have to do with public expenditure going in different ways than others. Is there corruption? Is there corruption? How is there? Does it have to do with the type of government suppliers are being contracted or not? And that kind of involvement has drawn about interesting reflections on how government is actually working. And the third thing that has been very interesting with the rallies on fiscal transparency is that people start trusting more the government, because they go there and they see that the information they see in the portal and on the map is actually it's being built. So that increases sometimes trust in this case on government. One of the big things that we've seen throughout this work with the fiscal transparency area at the national level is that the biggest claims is that people want to have the same detailed information, in this case in maps as products, but also in the open data formats from all the levels of government, specifically at the municipal level, because it is there where much of the government is spending the money that directly affects people's lives. For instance, just roads, illumination, public spaces, security, and those kinds of issues, and they start demanding that information because they want to know what's going on with government expenditure. I will continue just mentioning, and I think that Mike can show you and send you lots of the links regarding open contracting. One of the things that has changed a lot in the past 3 years within the open data community is that open contracting has become a sub-community within the open data space. And it has two very important characteristics. The first one has to do with a technical standard. Now, if you go and visit OCP, the Open Contracting Partnership, and the different projects that have to do with it, you will find that there are standards on how public contracts should be published so that people can use it. And there is a global effort there to have the same standards of open contracting data publication. And that brings not only for end users and intermediaries to compare the data that has to do with contracting, but also to compare governments and even countries. And as we're talking about data as a platform, we'll see that yes, either enterprises, civil society, or other government areas can actually use that data as an input for their analysis or even identifying public policy opportunities or endeavors. I will show two last projects that have to do with data as a platform that do not have to do with government. Actually, they have to do when civil society or technology groups or journalism groups react when there is a lack of open data on the government side. Slide number 20 has to do with public expenses. And this was an effort that did a very renowned newspaper in Argentina, working alongside the open data and technology community in Buenos Aires. So basically what they did here in 2013, 14, and 15 was to access to information channels and mechanisms the public expenses from the Argentinian Congress. Since the Argentinian Congress did not have an open data platform, as many other congresses in Latin America do, what they did is their alternative effort to publish that information. But it was a huge effort because much of that data that was accessed by access to information mechanisms was basically closed data, was scanned documents. PDFs in the best case scenario. So there was a big combination of efforts between the technological and the journalistic community, not only to extract, as you saw with Camila in the previous lessons, to extract through OCR technology images so it can be structured to have the different variables and data from a public expense. For instance, you have the name of the supplier, you have the total, you have the content of what was being purchased, and that is basically, first of all, extracted either by using OCR from an image for like a scanned document, or digit by hand, or sometimes extracted or scraped through technology from a PDF. So that could be actually building a public database. And the interesting thing here is that even though sometimes journalists are sometimes very jealous about the information, La Nación data in this case was actually the opposite. So they had a public open data, public expenses platform on the Argentinian Congress. And that led not only for their own journalists, but other think tanks, journalists, and analysts to arrive and to build, and that's what we have on the right, many of the stories and reflections about how was different people within the Congress spending the Argentinian Congress budget in detail and with different kinds of stories. The next project and the last project I'd like to share with you guys that has to do with data as a platform is a very nice and encouraging project from Medellin. Medellin is a city in Colombia. Did not have like an air quality office from the government that would actually measure and publish the data of how was the quality of the air in different parts of the city. For instance, other cities like Buenos Aires or like Mexico City or like many other American cities already have an open data platform and even an API in which all the recordings of the air quality they have on different antennas and sensors throughout the city are being published. So that can actually provide the information for different third parties. For instance, if you're a runner, you might have an app that actually builds upon that data to tell you if it's actually safe for you to run in certain parts of the city or not. Or if you're like in a school, you can tell the kids if they can go outside and run and have um, activity, open air activities, depending on the air quality. But the interesting story about the air quality projects within Medellin was that it was basically the technological community that started using very common and cheap sensors to measure and generate the air quality in the country. They did a first project with some basic sensors, and they showed and they started partnering with the local municipality so that that could be replicated. And then the municipality started projects to measure air quality in a much more systematic way. And the interesting thing is that despite not having the optimal air quality measuring technology, as other cities have, as I mentioned before, what this combination between technologists and government did was to start bringing upon the subject and recording air quality and making it public through an API so that others could consume it in a very cheap and do-it-yourself approach. So if that could be done with air quality in Medellin, there's something that could be done anywhere else in the world. I will continue with another kinds of projects, and this has to do with one of the primarily use of open data, which is basically analysis. Now I'm going to start with slide number 23. There is analysis within government. There is a current project within the Mexican social development area of the national government, which is basically like an internal lab that consults and gathers all the open data from different parts of government, mostly the social development ministry, in order to identify different variables that can lead to more precise and adequate public policy decision making. And I'm basically sharing in this slide two of the indicators they work with, even though they work with a lot of indicators. One has to do with risk, and one has to do with threats. So what they're doing there, and they have basically a team of data scientists working with all the government data internally, is to identify, for instance, what parts of the country and what populations, in this case, have different kinds of risks, and based on other data sets within the Mexican government, for instance, climate or agriculture or economic databases, can be mixed and compared to identify the threats that marginalized communities need in order to not only focus but anticipate better the resources or the social development programs that should be targeting these populations. For instance, if you have a marginalized community that might be in a high risk of impact if there would be a drought, and there is data on climate that might suggest that there would be a drought in certain parts of the country. If you cross that, and I'm being very simple, I mean this is being done by algorithms with lots of variables, but you could actually anticipate that certain parts of the country in those communities which are highly marginalized, if they're hit by a drought, would need a specific support based on a social development program, probably agriculture or even cash transfers, in order not to get much more affected by that drought. So the key here, and this is a very interesting new project, is that open data has government as a client also. And it should not be seen as something only for citizens and intermediaries. And intermediaries are within the country, within the government. In this case, we're seeing that these intermediaries are based on analysis in order to provide key public policy orientation and and advice. I'm going to go to the next project, which is regarding fiscal budgeting in core economic government data. In slide 24, we have the work of a Mexican NGO that is very specialized on fiscal budgeting. And what they have done eventually as a service, as a product in a way, even though they don't charge for it, is they have simulators on how the national economy and budgeting is working. So they started off with a very complex. If you visit their website in the SIEP page, they have a very complex simulator that is obviously focused for specialized users. I don't have the economic and budgeting knowledge to understand all the variables that go into fiscal budgeting at a country level, for instance. And they have done a simulator, but also try to make it as easy to understand as possible. How do the changes within, like for example, a prospective budget could affect expenditures, but also other kinds of budgets within a national budgeting cycle. So every time that that the Congress is in the yearly approval period of the yearly budget, this website becomes very visited, because not only government officials that are working on the different scenarios on budgeting, but also analysts like journalists, academics, or specialized individuals on budgeting actually work with that data and that simulator to see the different scenarios of what could happen if different variables within the national budget are being changed. And finishing off with data focused on analysis projects, I would like to show one project that is done by an individual in Mexico. There is a guy that has gathered all the open data on crime and security, and has a website that is focalizing on basically those topics. And the value added, which is basically the analysis he does based on the open data, is not only just to visualize the data as you see in this map, but also to identify the patterns and the trends that the data is showcasing in crime. And for instance, his analysis, even though he's just one guy with a website, not a team, not an NGO, not a university, two things that he's been mentioning a lot regarding crime security in Mexico has been, for instance, which are the data anomalies regarding crime and security. For instance, some parts of the country are usually under-reporting crime and security. And he kind of like identifies with his analysis, all right, let's see such and such part of the country, like a state or a municipality, so we can identify why isn't that rate the same as others, or why is it so low. So he's pretty much identified like those kinds of anomalies. And the other thing that he's been doing throughout the years is to identify the different patterns of how crime is evolving in different parts of the country. For instance, not only homicides, but also all kinds of robberies, like robberies, or like kidnapping, or like assaults, and how is that being correlated depending on the part of the country he's analyzing, and the increase or the decrease of the criminal activity in the country. For instance, recently he has done very interesting analysis on the rise of different kinds of crime, depending on how the drug cartels are shifting throughout the region, especially in the north part of the country. I'm gonna continue with the projects, and don't worry, I have two sets of different kinds of projects left. So and you have the copy of the presentation with the links, so you can continue at home looking at those projects. But I'm going to go now with projects that are sometimes considered as platforms that provide a service to citizens. So usually we see data as a service. And as a service, you can think about very commercial aspects, but think about like information services. What information do you need every day? What information sometimes you have to Google, and it's sometimes you don't find it, or it's very complex to find, that if there was an app or there was a platform or there was something that would actually make your life easier, you would actually consume that service a lot. One of the things we've learned in the technology business is that people will not download an app unless they actually require that information on their common needs in their daily basis. No? And I'm going to show three examples of data as a service, actually 4 examples of data as a service in terms of first, well, mostly civil society in government contexts. The first one has to do with something that has to do with e-participation, electronic participation on participatory budgeting. There, depending on, because that varies a lot. There's different participatory budgeting at different levels of government. Mostly the participatory budgeting has been done at a local level, at a municipality level. That has been much more relevant and useful for different people. But there's now technology based on, for example, budgeting data and other kinds of data that can help out and can channel the citizen participation not only to identify the budgeting opportunities they can actually give input to, but also bid and participate on where the money should go. And sometimes they mix that with simulators so that people can have a much more informed approach in terms of budgeting. So you as for instance, within your municipality could actually see and play around with the simulator and identify, okay, what ideas should you push and where is the money, where if you're putting money to a certain project and not the other, what would be the lack of balance between that. Actually, the lessons from the municipality of Madrid in Spain have been amazing, not only in terms of like citizen participation, but also in getting people involved through online and offline efforts on participative budgeting for local decision making, not only special projects, but also just budgets and expense allocation within the municipality. No? So one of the projects we follow a lot is what's going on in the City de Madrid, in Madrid, Spain. I'm going to jump into something that already Fabricio talked about, but it's basically an example of how when open data is basically configured in a way that citizens can understand, can help decision making. No? A tu servicio, as Fabricio mentioned in the first session, in slide here, I have it in slide 28, has helped the Uruguayans to identify what the quality and how the different health centers have been assessed in the country. No? And that brings the power for people not only to identify where to go, where not to go, they have to attend a health center, but also sometimes to advocate internally, externally, so that certain aspects of quality within health services should be improved. And that changes pretty much the rules of engagement with citizens. If you analyze the traditional way of advocacy, is basically just blocking roads and shouting at the government. If you start putting data and making visible the scorecards and establishing a channel so that people can understand what's going on, how are, in this case, health centers, but you can apply it to any other parts of government, how can that is improving or not, how those offices and services at the governmental level are being rated. Citizens have the possibility to actually, in a more proactive way, and not just blocking streets and yelling, suggest and support different different proposals and requirements for the government. No, another project that is very much in line with this and has been a classic now in the open data community in the past almost 10 years in the Latin American context is the one that I have in slide 29, which is Mejora tu Escuela. And this is a website that started off with a very complex and difficult data cleaning, gathering, and access challenge. An NGO, through initially access to information, eventually through open data, public open data, started gathering all the information regarding schools. And all the information started with basic information on schools, where they are, the telephone, what's the name of the director, I mean, basic things. And eventually they started putting other kinds of data regarding the schools. And they started comparing schools based on what I mentioned before in the presentation, which is the quality of education that had been assessed within these schools. And the interesting thing about this project was that initially it had a massive visitor analytics and record. I mean, massive, we're talking about millions of people that visited the website, mostly because of organic searches. Because people were actually looking for basic information, where the school is, who the director is, what time is it open, what are the characteristics or the profiles of the school, and that was something that is up to now not set in a website from the government in one website. So these NGOs just brought basic needs to one website so people can understand and can access basic information on schools, on public schools within the whole country. And the second thing that happened and they did was the comparison part you are seeing here in the website in the slide, which is you could compare one school to the other based on the quality assessment of education of each school. So if you are a mom or a dad and want to see where to put your children, the first question would be not only where's the school, so what's the rate of the quality of education in each of the schools, and that would be a starting point for decision making based on education. No? And I'm going to finish off with a basic quick win on open data within government. Public transportation. I'm not talking a lot about it, but public transportation usually is a basic need, transactional basic need for citizens. If you can actually transform that raw data or just put it there so others can provide services based on that data on public transportation, I mean, that would actually help and support people's lives. Usually we'll see eventually on open data, first of all, maps. If there is no maps within a city. I remember very clearly an effort in Nicaragua 2 years ago in which civil society and technology groups actually ended up mapping the city of Managua and publishing the maps in OpenStreetMaps and actually printing out the maps of the informal public transportation routes, so people can know where the bus is actually going, because it's informal public transportation, and the government did not have that information and did not make it public. But what I have in this case, in this slide, is something that it has become much more common in different in cities around the world, which is basically having those public bicycle services in which if you see it with a data point, you'll see that each bicycle is a data entry, and you can see where that bicycle is being dropped off and taken. So the end user, through an app, mobile app, or even a website, can identify if the bicycle stations, in this case, if you want to go into not only bicycles, but also as some modern cities are doing it with electric cars or electric motorcycles, where are those public transportation spots being available, where you can actually go and get those bicycles or motorcycles or electric cars, no? And that's basic services for citizens on the everyday life. I remember once, and that's basically a personal anecdote, reaching a full station of bicycles in Mexico City and asking the policeman in the corner if he knew where the other station was, so I could drop off my my bicycle. And the guy said, like, "Don't you have the app?" So I mean, it's basically something that is very transactional. We all need in a city, and it is sometimes quite easy to build, and that can provide a service to citizens. And the government sometimes it doesn't have to be the one that does it. All right. So I'm going to finish off with the last block of projects that have to do more with storytelling and using data as compelling as possible as a part of getting people to understand a topic or of interest. And I see finally a chat that asks that who would be the best office to manage the release of this type of data regarding the private institutions. And I'm talking about you're talking about school assessments. Well, that depends country by country. Sometimes all the private institutions, all of the private schools, at least in the Mexican context, and I think other countries, are obliged to fulfill quality education assessments. And not only the international, but I'm not an expert on education policy and assessment, but I think that varies country by country. And the point here is that such a service on making the people understand what is the different quality of the schools, if it goes into private and public schools, could be very valuable if there is a mandate for public schools to actually undergo the same assessments as public schools in a country. But well, unfortunately, I'm not an expert in education. I cannot tell you about those details. Just going to finish off quite quickly with first of all, how to make data didactic and how to make in a way that people can understand and what technology is usually being used, and eventually ending up identifying what the role of data is in storytelling and how to take people by the hand and make data compelling and understandable in different processes. So the first approaches I'd like to share with you guys is in slide number 32, which is basically some an education piece that did a newspaper in Guatemala, Plaza Pública, in order to make people understand and be very didactic in terms of how the income was different in different kinds of families in different parts of the country in Guatemala and what they were able to purchase. So they did a video and they did kind of like a small simulator in which you could actually see in a very clear way what kind of things could a household purchase or not depending on their income. Basically that. And it was they used graphic design in a way that was quite evident, and everybody could actually follow that simulator and understand what was the effect of different purchasing powers depending on a household income. The next one is another simulator that is basically the mixture between lots of data in the background and lots of storytelling and a lot of graphic design and trying to have animations. The colleagues of CIEP in Mexico have tried to make understand or to be didactic on something that's sometimes very hard for people, everyday people, to understand. In this case, I'm showing the simulator that tries to explain, and it's kind of like a small video game, how the public pension system in Mexico is working. And for instance, they try to, through a character, try to be very didactic, to identify, okay, what happens when you as an individual end up retiring, and if you use a private or a public pension system, how much money is there, and how much is the money that is actually in those budgets for different kinds of pensions in the country, no? So at the end, this is basically a journey. They have like an 8-bit animation for that project, in which you start learning about, like, okay, there are different kinds of pension systems within Mexico, both within the government, also for the public pension system, and also for the private pension system. How much money they have, how much money they're gathering, and eventually, depending on the people that are that will be recipients of those pensions, how much money will eventually, throughout time, they're going to have, so you can identify what kind of pensions you will be able to receive depending on what kind of pension system you're in. So there are sometimes efforts that combine very technical understanding of, in this case, pension system, but also of the data and the statistics that they can help anybody understand not only how the pension system works, but also eventually how that would affect anybody else. And continuing with the project, I'll focus more the notion on storytelling and data for narratives. And in slide number 35, we have something that we sometimes consider as the use of data as context. And you'll see a lot of that in data journalism. Data journalism sometimes will have the stories based on people. And that person they're talking about, in this case, I have an American example on fracking. And they have the story, and they do a little story in the reporting, in this case of Rebecca or Don Martin, and they use data to identify that little dot on a map or that statistic is basically the example of a broader pattern or context. In this case, we like very much this project because they combine very well the individual stories, the aspects, and the in this case, people that are suffering from fracking, but the data contextualizes the degree of the project, of the problem that regarding fracking. So it's this is very nice to see there the human stories, but I understand that that person is not the only body affected by, in this case, fracking. But if you see the data as a pattern, you'll see the context that is a broader and larger projects. Sometimes, and I'm shifting into a Brazilian project in slide number 33, this is basically classic, the use of data as a support for a story, sometimes as an argument. And I really like that they have like this is basically a story in terms of hydroelectric efficiency, and they put on all the data regarding the different types of hydroelectric projects and spaces within Brazil, and they highlight, in this case, Belo Monte and the characteristic it has. The interesting part of using data as a support for stories is that you can actually do the interventions and tell the reader or your user, hey, the data is telling us this thing, and then you can continue explaining the whole story or the whole pattern, no? And there is when sometimes the adequate use of graphs or some infographics can point out what actually the data analysis told you when you were working as an intermediary analyzing a phenomenon or an aspect. And just to finish off, one of the other use of data, mostly linked to having data as an intermediary in analysis perspective, is that sometimes the data will give you the, in this case, journalistic, but also social or analysis revelations. No, I really like this project. It's a Spanish and Latin American project that has to do with Latin American crops, and not only what are these crops, what is their role within these countries, for example, coffee in Colombia, but how is the relationship in the affections that the crops are being are suffering in an international context. So what they did here is to understand how are certain crops being sold, at what price, and to whom throughout the world, and what is the effects that has had, especially in the producing countries of those crops. So the combination here is that it was the data, and I liked really the graph in the bottom because it gives you and it brings you it brings you by the hand the story throughout the years on how the production of certain crops has changed, and what the prices have been. And it starts telling you the revelations of based on that data. For instance, what was the effect on when on certain communities, on a certain country, when certain crop actually fell in price a lot or increased its price. All right, who bought it and what bought it? So data is there in telling you why did something happen, especially in the past. And well, I think we're finishing off here, and just to open up the space, before opening up the space for questions and answers, I'd like to just finish out by highlighting something that Mike and I and many others in the Latin America open data community are very fond of, and we think that it's basically the core of not only innovation but the value that open data can bring, which is basically the communities. And I'd like to share three things about data-driven communities with you guys. The first one has to do with formal communities. Latin America and the Caribbean, we have worked a lot with formal communities, trying to build specific aspects in how to formally not only build data literacy capacities, but share and do projects amongst each other. Every year there is a regional Latin American and Caribbean conference, which is called Condatos. This year it is joining efforts with the International Open Data Conference, and that is also joined with an unconference from the civil society perspective, in which we join each other and share not only the challenges, but also how we're dealing with the different efforts in opening and using data. No? So after 6 years, I think the community is very, very large. And one of the best aspects about this, at least Latin American Caribbean communities, is that we are not alone, and we can actually share the best and the lessons learned that we have had, so we can actually do our job better and start off from a stronger point of view. The School of Data community was mostly focused on training and building resources with a Spanish-speaking community in Escuela de Datos. We've tried to have like fellows that could promote, train, and work on specific projects throughout Latin America. And on an international perspective, also the School of Data has done the same things in the past also 6 years. And Hilda, as Fabricio, I'm sure, mentioned in the first session, is trying to do the research approach and building and bridging the different communities so we can understand what's going on the open data front, both on the civil society and also on the government aspects. I also want to talk to you about informal communities, because we do not have to be an NGO or an institution or government to work together and to do stuff together. One of the most encouraging and fruitful activities we've done, at least in Mexico and SocialTIC and throughout the fellowships in different other countries, has been to do data meetups. In our case, because we're Mexican and we like, in this case, tequila or mezcal, we usually bring a drink and people share experiences and their data-driven projects. And that has led not only to a greater visibility on the opening data efforts from the government, but also on the use. It is there where people understand what others are doing and actually start collaborations there. So informal communities in, for example, meetups, but not the technology meetups that usually you'll find with technology communities, but the meetups that have to do with data users. And sometimes you'll have like very sophisticated top-end data users like data scientists, and you'll have like very less literate data users, sometimes journalists that are engaging in data journalism. But it's important to have mixed communities that can talk and share experiences on how they're using opening data. And that brings up to the last, my last reflection here, which is that especially from a government side, it is very important to be in touch with those who use the data and those who demand the data, those intermediaries. And the picture I put here is an exercise that we coordinated early this year to identify what was the data was available and what was the data was needed in emergency response. Because in Mexico we had an earthquake, a couple of earthquakes in September last year, and we were still in a reconstruction process early this year in 2018. And there was a need to understand, okay, what data do we need and what data is available, not only from government data, but also from civil society that has been generated data, to understand where can we focus our efforts in terms of reconstruction, volunteering, economic efforts, and long-lasting political public policy and political will efforts in the reconstruction process. That list of data needs is really relevant for the government to have, because if not, you might be thinking that some data is needed, which is at the end is not needed, and it is very important to have a thermometer of what the demand is on data, because opening data is a challenge and implies a lot of effort, not only politically but also technically in terms of like scraping, cleaning, and everything you know about data management. The optimal space here is not only to have informal activities within mixed communities, government and non-government users and data experts, but even to have kind of like an inbox similar to what we have sometimes in the access to information platforms, in which you can tell, I mean, users can actually demand or ask for the government to focus their effort on opening certain kinds of data or not the others. So, well, I think that is enough for today. If you have any questions, please let me know. I think my English speaking skills are arriving to an end. But please let me know if you have any questions in the chat. And I'm very thankful for your attention. And we're here as a whole community to answer any questions and to support your projects. Thanks a lot.
I want to thank you, Juan Manuel, highly for this presentation. Very detailed. It definitely, as I said, it moved, uh, it built in the things that we learned during the last session. So I think this is great. Seeing your perspective, it's wonderful. Takeaways, two very important on my side. There are many. While some of the participants prepared questions there, I'm just going to say citizen participation and engagement. It's critical, and I think you brought it up. Analyzing basically engineering the way this could work by not just opening, but bringing civil society together to think about the end result. I think it's just something that it has to be embedded in the culture of opening data. So thank you very much. As I said, I could go on many points of the ones you presented, but I want to thank you highly for this, and of course to through you to SocialTIC and the School of Data as well for this. I'm sure that we'll have the time to continue exploring the different cases that you presented. We share all the links on the chat, and I think that's going to be great also for the participants to dive in. Part of the purpose of these sessions was precisely to get people motivated, get public officials motivated, and I think all these cases just leave us with a lot of questions, a lot of ideas, and a lot of expectation as well as to where and how I do this and how easy I get to do this. So great. I won't put any question there for you. There was one on the chat, and then I will let actually Mr. Henry Wade, our project local coordinator, to moderate this final session. We do have time constraints as the time has moved on. I'll let you, Henry, deal with that, depending on how we move with the questions with the participants, coming from the participants. So go ahead, Henry, and the microphone is all yours.
Okay, can you hear me, guys? Okay, Juan, again, so much. I want to repeat what Mike had said. It was a brilliant presentation, very, very informative. As these presentations continue, I know I speak for myself when I'm getting, as Mike said, enthused, energized, and excited about having open data and open government here in Belize. And I'm quite sure that our participants are getting motivated and excited as well. I've had a couple discussions with them subsequent to some of the previous sessions, and I could tell there's a lot of potential here. We're sort of at that ground level, fresh, clean slate, and we are embracing all the knowledge and knowing that there are a lot of experts out there who've done quite a bit of incredible projects and work with open data and open government. So I know that our participants are going to be fully motivated to continue. With that being said, as Mike noted, this is the final session on open data in partnership with CITO and our other public sector institutions. Namely, we have members from the Customs Department, from Ministry of Public Service, our Immigration Department here, the Development Finance Corporation, Ministry of Natural Resources, and also CITO as well. So it's been a wide, broad spectrum of different personnel who've been together with us from the beginning all the way until this final session. So again, thank you all participants for being here. So just to dive right in, my first question would be, and noting the time, I'm not sure if you had covered Pablo's question regarding health and school assessments. Juan? Was that earlier question addressed?
Yes. I tried to. I'm not a specialist in education, so I'm not sure if like public schools would be assessed the same way in different countries.
Yes, and I
I'm not.
see Pablo noted that yes, he had that you had addressed it. So I guess I have a question, and it follows two questions. If we could jump into them quickly, following the final slide that you have in terms of identifying demand. What types of methodologies would you recommend? Again, seeing that open government, open data is brand new to the country. What type of methodologies would you recommend? I note that you mentioned earlier about a public inbox, so to speak. What would be some of the best practices for the institutions internally? All the participants, they represent various institutions, for them to start their own in-house um, demand identification exercise. What would be some of the best practices that you recommend?
Basically, first of all, three. One is sometimes within government you can arrive to an estimate of what demand is. For instance, one of the things we've done in different with different governments in Latin America is whenever there is enough data on access to information requests, that is an indicator of what kind of a demand on especially topics and in particular data sets that are needed. That's one, and that could be applied to um, other spaces or mechanisms in which citizens also ask for data. For instance, at the local level, there was a very interesting analysis within Mexico City a couple of years ago, in which we analyzed what people asked for in this local hotline. And basically, those topics were basically demand that ended up being take into account for the open data efforts, but also on having much better social communication approaches. No? The second thing has to do with reaching out and having an outreach with specific data users, data user communities. No? And you can use that a lot by working with sectors, no, the environment, health, whatever, no. And sometimes you do have if you can establish workshops or focus groups. So can people identify, okay, based on their experiences, and reach out and tell you what the data sets are the ones that they really need, and and you should take into consideration in order to provide efforts in opening that kind of data. No, sectorial working groups on open data are usually key, even though sometimes they're sometimes hard to establish because you have to have an outreach strategy with those groups. No, and the last one is yeah, the one I was mentioning, to have a kind of like an inbox in order to gather people's demands. No, and that is sometimes very complex to start, but once it gets going, it is a right place to tell some users and go back to them and tell them, hold on, I don't have the capacity right now to open this data, or yes, no problem, here it is. So that communication with data users is actually the best thing you could have, and eventually from the government side, the data users become basically your constituents or your clients, and you start having a better communication link with them, not only online but also offline.
Excellent, thank you. And my second question would be, earlier in the presentation, you noted that uh, for some public sector institutions, they don't have an adequate action plan or strategy to make data available. And this is something similar that we've heard in previous sessions as well. So I'd want you to share comments to the participants in terms of overcoming some of these challenges or hesitations to make data available without a formal open data policy in their institutions. What would you recommend to our participants?
Well, I think that what we've seen, at least in lived in all the process, and what we're now talking about, like 8 years in Mexico, is that opening data builds trust. Uh, and even though there is no open data policy, um, at least in Mexico, we were trying, before we had the open data policy, we were trying to use as as a government jargon or policy anchor, mostly the practical transparency discourse. But when a public official or a government area starts opening data and outreach and having an outreach to those data users, I mean that certainly builds trust. And if you link it with something that is a bit nerdy, but actually has a has an impact with society, which is to build together like practical solutions, that actually is a very proactive thing and puts another face of government towards citizenships. For instance, the example I put about the public bicycles in Mexico City initially, and that's basically off the record. No. Initially, there was a big conflict because the local ministry on public transportation did not want to release the data, and there was a hacker that actually illegally opened that data up, and the first app was done. So, I mean, the first app to identify where the bicycle stations were was done basically illegally. And they, instead of punishing the hacker, they actually did the right thing, which is open up the data and encourage others to have a much better apps built upon that data and using that data as clients. No? And that just started off a different logic on how to deal with the citizen demands in something as basic as where is the bicycle I can use. So an opposite example is I know is from Ecuador, in which from the public energy company, they had an API so you could actually access your electricity bill through a website. And when they started receiving lots of consumers, because instead of waiting for the paper bill to be delivered to your house, you could actually access it online on a website that a guy, just a technician, built. They actually closed that API and frustrated the service that, even though it was not like done by the government, it was done by the government data, no, based on the government data, no. So they ended up frustrating many of the users they already had of that basically information on the electric bill. So I don't know if that answers a bit the approaches. No? And just to finish up, no, but just to finish up, I'm sorry about the interruption. Sometimes it's not about just opening whatever data you have. That could be interesting if you're starting off with a data portal or whatever, but it's sometimes much more strategical to work alongside data groups and users and opening data that is actually much more relevant. And then, yes, expectations will increase, but it makes sense for the data users and also for the end users for government to open data. And also internally within government it makes a lot of sense because you're starting a virtuous cycle by the start, not just opening data.
Perfect. Thank you, Juan. I see we have a comment by Byron. He's from the Ministry of Public Service, and he's noted that the presentation was quite exciting. We can see high quality projects developed and lots of opportunities right in front of us. I totally agree, Byron, and I'm sure other participants will too. And he's hoping to meet Juan soon to help us in some of these initiatives. So, yes, we welcome you, Juan, and all the rest of presenters in supporting Belize's drive towards that open data and open government pathway. And finally, Byron asks somewhat of a technical question, Juan. What type of employee positions or perhaps skill sets are recommended for building a team to undertake such an initiative or these open data initiatives?
I'm going to start with a negative, which is not the IT people by themselves. Please don't. No, there has to be a combination between yes, the IT people, but also area leads and project leads. Um, and it's basically it is those people within government that have the institutional and also the political power to create new things. Uh-huh. And if they work alongside with the IT teams, I mean that I mean all the technicalities are easier to address, and they don't become like enemies because they were not included. And eventually, as more sophisticated data-driven products are done, yeah, the team has to be a bit more diverse, and you have to include people with communication skills and also graphic design skills. Just to share the more or less the evolution that the budget transparency in national team in Mexico has done is that 5 years ago there were basically three people in charge of the on the area. They were basically economists specialized in budget transparency, and they worked with the IT team, and they launched the first platform on fiscal budget transparency. And after that, they started building a broader, much more diverse team that included a graphic designer, and they included more a communications and outreach team that did social media, but also did all the outreach with different data communities. And that has given them a totally different, not only types of outputs they do with the data, but also a different relationship with their data communities.
So
I don't know if
audio was up. Byron, can you share with us the portion that you'd like Juan to repeat, if any?
Say that again, Henry. I'm
Yeah, Mike.
sorry.
I see that Byron made a comment that the audio was breaking up, so I asked if Byron could share with us the portion of the audio he would like Juan to repeat, if any.
Okay. Got it. I heard it well, and let's see what Byron tells us in the chat. And just for as a reminder, we'll share the video of the presentation so you can go over it. We actually encourage all participants to share it within your institutions and with other colleagues as well. Henry, just due to time, and I know Juan Manuel should be just trying to get to another call, another thing, and responsibility. Same as with all the participants, we might want to just to start closing now. Henry, I'll let you do that. Thank you.
Okay, Mike, thank you. Yeah, I see Byron typing in the chat box. Let's see what he says. But okay, the last part's about team. Hoping to get that on the recording. Yes, yes, Byron. I do think the recording was clear on my end, as Mike noted. So I do believe a review of the video will have everything that Juan had mentioned earlier. But as Mike noted, guys, we are at the close of today's session, the final session on open data. Again, I just want to thank all the participants who have been with us from the beginning to our final session. We want to thank our partners, CITO, on the ground for providing a lot of logistical support in organizing and coordinating with the different participants. And absolutely, we want to thank all our presenters today. Juan, thank you so much for a very, very informative presentation. Thank you for taking your time out. I know that there, upon review, there's probably going to be quite a bit more questions coming your way. So we invite all the participants. If there are any questions that you would like us to ask our presenters, and Juan had shared his contact information, please feel free to do so. So ideally, we want to close at this point. Again, thank you, participants. Thank you, Juan. I will share my contact information in the chat, guys. So please feel free to reach out to me so that we can move some of perhaps your own in-house initiatives further in terms of reaching out to presenters, reaching out to our experts, or securing more information on data in general. Please feel free to, as Mike said, reach out to me, coordinator here in Belize. There's my email and my phone number, and also keep in touch with us on our Facebook page. So that's facebook.com/OpenGovBelize, where we're introducing new content. All the videos are going to be posted up there as well. So like our page and feel free to share with your friends and colleagues. So with that said, Mike, I want to turn it over to you for any final words, and Juan as well. Any final words to our participants?
Thank you, Henry. Just to say thank you to Juan Manuel. Thank you to all the participants. I should acknowledge the fact that you've been committed and constant in these sessions. So thank you very much. I don't want to make any mistake, but I think I will do a fair acknowledgement if I say that Inaldi Gomez was quite committed from the very beginning, participating in all the trainings. I know everybody has, but as I've seen Inaldi active, then I just want to acknowledge that. Of course, to the CITO colleagues, thank you very much for that opportunity to have you participating and sharing this and always present and constant in these sessions. That is highly important. And to all, to be honest with you, that have participated, thank you very much. I'm just gonna say that, and final words for Juan Manuel for the closing, and that's it. Thank you. We continue to be engaged on this.
Thank you very much for the space, and let's keep in touch. We're very near geographically, so I hope we can maintain the contact.
Thank you all. See you next time.